Stop pretending you have money, Drake. My wife's sister rolled her eyes at her dad's birthday dinner. I handed my black card to pay the $3,000 bill. It got declined. My wife and her family burst out laughing. Then the manager rushed over. Mr. Anderson, so sorry. We still owe you $500,000 from last month's catering contract. You know that feeling when you've been planning something for weeks, dotting every I and crossing every T, making sure everything's absolutely perfect? Yeah, well, that was me for the past month, obsessing over every single detail of my father-in-law Robert's 60th birthday dinner. And let me tell you, when you're dealing with Lou Bernardine, the kind of place where they probably polish the silverware with $100 bills, perfection doesn't come cheap. $3,000. 3,000 American dollars. That's what I dropped on this dinner, and honestly, standing there in the entrance, watching those crystal chandeliers catch the light like some kind of fancy disco ball, I figured it was worth every penny. The place screamed money louder than a Wall Street trader having a meltdown, and the view of the Manhattan skyline through those floor-to-ceiling windows? Chef's kiss. Pure Instagram gold. The maitre d' led us to our table like we were royalty or something, which, considering what I was paying, we basically were for the night. Robert's face lit up the moment he saw the setup. I'd specifically requested the corner table with the best view, the one that probably costs more per hour than most people make in a day. His smile was worth every sleepless night I'd spent coordinating this whole production. Drake, this is, wow, he said, his voice carrying that genuine appreciation that makes all the stress worth it. The man had worked his ass off for 60 years, building his accounting firm from scratch, and seeing him happy like this? That's the good stuff right there. Clara, my wife, seemed pleased at first. She was doing that thing where she gets all elegant and sophisticated, sitting up straighter, using her fancy restaurant voice. You know the one. Suddenly, every word sounds like it belongs in a wine commercial. This is beautiful, honey, she said, squeezing my hand under the table. For a hot minute, I thought maybe, just maybe, this would be the night her family finally saw me as more than just the guy who somehow convinced their daughter to marry down. But then I caught sight of Bianca. Oh, Bianca, my sister-in-law, the queen of passive-aggressive commentary and the undisputed champion of making me feel like I don't belong. She was sitting there across from me, wearing that trademark smirk of hers like it was designer jewelry. You know that look, the one that says, I know something you don't know, and I can't wait to use it against you. Her perfectly manicured nails were already drumming against the table, and I could practically see the wheels turning in her head, calculating the exact moment to drop whatever bomb she'd been preparing. Next to her sat Trevor, her husband, who had somehow managed to perfect the art of looking bored and superior at the same time. The guy was leaning back in his chair like he owned the place, swirling his wine glass with the kind of practiced indifference that screams, I peaked in college and never got over it. His eyes had that predatory gleam that meant he was just waiting, hoping, for me to screw something up so he could pounce on it like a cat on a laser pointer. I tried to ignore them, really I did. This night was supposed to be about Robert, about showing him the respect and appreciation he deserved, not about whatever psychological warfare his daughters had planned. So I focused on the menu, made sure everyone knew about the chef's specials, played the perfect host. The lobster arrived, and watching Robert dig in was like watching a kid on Christmas morning. The man was practically glowing, telling stories about his early days in business, laughing at his own jokes in that endearing way that made you want to laugh along even when the punchline was older than disco. For a few precious minutes, everything was perfect. Clara's mom, Evelyn, was doing her usual thing, sitting there with that tight smile that could mean anything from, I'm having a lovely time, to, I'm mentally planning your funeral. With her, you never really know which way the wind's blowing until it's too late. She kept making these little humming sounds of approval at the food, which I was choosing to interpret as positive feedback rather than the sound effects of someone slowly dying inside. Marcus, Clara's younger brother, was fresh out of business school and still had that cocky confidence that comes with a newly minted MBA and zero real-world experience. He kept checking his phone, probably updating his LinkedIn profile or something equally thrilling. Every now and then he'd look up and nod sagely, like he was mentally taking notes on how successful people dine or some crap like that. But I could feel it building. That tension that settles over family gatherings like storm clouds over a picnic. Bianca's smirk was getting wider. Trevor was getting more relaxed, which in his case was never a good sign. It was like watching a row of dominoes get set up, knowing that eventually, someone was going to flick the first one. I kept telling myself to stay focused on Robert. This was his night, his celebration. The man who'd built something from nothing, who'd raised 3 kids while growing a business, who'd somehow managed to stay married to Evelyn for 35 years without completely losing his mind. He deserved this moment of recognition, this fancy dinner with the people he loved most. But families, man. Families have this special talent for taking a perfectly good moment and turning it into a psychological minefield. And as I sat there, watching Robert enjoy his perfectly prepared lobster while his family prepared to tear me apart, I couldn't help but think that maybe, just maybe, I should have gone with the nice Italian place down the street instead. The servers moved around our table like choreographed dancers, refilling water glasses and wine with that silent efficiency that only comes with years of practice and probably a healthy fear of their manager. The other diners in the restaurant were having their own quiet conversations, their own little dramas playing out over expensive plates and overpriced wine. And there I was, sitting in the middle of it all, trying to convince myself that everything was going to be fine, that this night would end with smiles and gratitude instead of the emotional bloodbath I could feel brewing. Sometimes being optimistic is less about positive thinking and more about willful denial. But hey, at least the chandeliers look nice. You ever have one of those moments where you can literally feel the universe shifting gears? Like, 1 second you're cruising along in cruise control, thinking everything's going smoothly, and then bam, reality decides to sucker punch you right in the gut? Well, welcome to my Tuesday night, folks. Bianca couldn't hold it in anymore. I swear, the woman had been sitting there for maybe 20 minutes, practically vibrating with the need to say something nasty, like a tea kettle about to blow its top. She'd been doing this thing where she'd take a sip of her wine, glance at me, then smirk at Trevor like they were sharing some inside joke at my expense. Classic Bianca move, building up to the big moment like some kind of sadistic performance artist. The waiter had just finished pouring the champagne. Dom Perignon, because apparently when you're dropping $3,000 on dinner, you don't mess around with the cheap stuff. When she finally unleashed her venom. The timing was absolutely perfect, of course. Nothing like a public humiliation served with a side of expensive bubbles. Stop pretending you have money, Drake. Just like that. 6 words that hit me like a freight train loaded with pure embarrassment. Her voice had that particular edge to it, the one she usually reserved for talking to customer service representatives or parking meter attendants. You know, people she considered beneath her notice. The words hung in the air like a bad smell, and I could feel every person at nearby tables suddenly developing superhuman hearing. My first instinct was to laugh it off, maybe make some joke about how money's just numbers in a computer anyway, but something in her tone told me this wasn't going to be one of those playful family roasts. This was Bloodsport, and I was apparently the main event. Clara, bless her heart, didn't exactly rush to my defense. Instead, she did this nervous little laugh. You know the one. Sounds like a chihuahua having an anxiety attack, and suddenly found her napkin absolutely fascinating. Real profile and courage there, honey. Nothing says, I've got my husband's back, like studying table linens while your sister tears him apart. Trevor, meanwhile, was practically glowing with satisfaction. The man actually snorted into his wine glass. Snorted, like this was the funniest thing he'd heard since whatever passes for comedy in his sad little world. I'm guessing it was either this or another hilarious story about his glory days playing JV football at some community college nobody's heard of. Robert looked like someone had just told him Santa Claus was actually a registered sex offender. The poor guy kept glancing between me and Bianca, his face all scrunched up in that way that says, I love my daughter, but Jesus Christ, why is she like this? He opened his mouth a couple times like he was going to say something, but then closed it again. I couldn't really blame him. Stepping between Bianca and her target was like jumping into a tank full of hungry sharks wearing a bacon suit. Evelyn, my dear mother-in-law, wasn't saying anything either, but her face was doing all the talking. That tight little smile of hers had shifted into something that looked dangerously close to approval. Not surprise, mind you, approval. Like she'd been waiting for this moment, probably since the day Clara brought me home. Her silence was louder than if she'd stood up, and started applauding. But wait, there's more. Because apparently one family member destroying my dignity wasn't enough entertainment for one evening. Marcus, fresh-faced and full of that special kind of arrogance that comes with a brand new business degree and zero life experience, decided to pile on. "Yeah, dinners like this aren't in your league," he said, leaning forward with all the confidence of someone who's never had to pay for anything more expensive than textbooks. "Don't ruin yourself trying to impress us. Don't ruin yourself trying to impress us. Let that sink in for a minute. This is a kid whose biggest financial responsibility up until 6 months ago was remembering to return his library books on time, and he's giving me advice about fiscal responsibility." The irony was so thick you could have cut it with the sterling silver butter knife that probably cost more than his monthly allowance. The thing that really got to me wasn't even the words themselves. It was the unified front they presented. Like they'd all gotten together beforehand and planned this little intervention. Operation Knock Drake down a peg, or something equally charming. There I was, thinking I was hosting a nice family dinner, and instead I'd walked straight into an ambush. Their laughter started spreading like some kind of contagious disease. First it was just Trevor snorting, then Bianca's sharp little cackles, then Marcus joining in with that forced laugh that college kids use when they're trying to seem mature, but just sound like they're choking on their own pretentiousness. Even Clara's nervous giggles were starting to sound more confident, like maybe she was finally picking a side. The worst part? Other people in the restaurant were starting to notice. I could see it in my peripheral vision, heads turning slightly, conversations pausing mid-sentence, that subtle shift that happens when strangers sense drama and can't help but rubberneck. Nothing quite like having your personal humiliation become dinner theater for a bunch of rich people trying to digest their overpriced fish. I could feel my face getting hot, that particular kind of embarrassment burn that starts in your chest and works its way up your neck like lava. My hands were clenched so tight around my napkin I was probably leaving permanent fingerprints in the fabric. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to either get up and leave or start throwing punches, but instead I just sat there like a deer in headlights, trying to process what the hell was happening. This was supposed to be Robert's night, his celebration, his moment to feel appreciated and loved by his family. And instead, his children had turned it into some kind of twisted reality show where the main entertainment was watching their sister's husband get emotionally eviscerated. The champagne in my glass suddenly looked a lot less appealing. In fact, the whole restaurant seemed to have lost some of its shine. Those beautiful chandeliers now felt like spotlights, highlighting my humiliation for everyone to see. The elegant atmosphere had turned into a coliseum, and I was the Christian being fed to the lions. But here's the thing about being cornered. Sometimes it forces you to fight back in ways you never expected. If I thought Bianca was done after her opening salvo, I was about as wrong as a weather forecast in tornado season. The woman was just getting warmed up, like a prize fighter who'd landed the first punch and could smell blood in the water. And me? I was the poor bastard tied to the railroad tracks, watching the train barrel toward me in slow motion. The laughter was spreading around our table like some kind of social contagion. What started as Trevor's obnoxious snorting had evolved into a full-blown comedy hour, with me as the unwilling star of the show. Other diners were trying to be discreet about their rubbernecking, but let's be honest, when you hear someone getting roasted alive at a fancy restaurant, you don't exactly look away. Human nature and all that. Bianca was really hitting her stride now, her voice getting louder with each word, like she was auditioning for some twisted dinner theater production. "You rent a small place in Queens, don't you?" she said, practically broadcasting it to the entire restaurant. The way she said Queens made it sound like I was living in a cardboard box under a bridge instead of a perfectly decent apartment that happened to be located outside Manhattan's insane real estate bubble. And suddenly you're playing big spender in Manhattan? She gestured around the restaurant like she was presenting evidence in court. "What's next, Drake? You gonna tell us you've got a yacht parked in the harbor?" The thing about Bianca is that she doesn't just insult you. She performs it. Every word is calculated for maximum impact, every pause timed for dramatic effect. She's like a surgeon, but instead of saving lives, she specializes in precision character assassination. And right now, I was strapped to her operating table while she went to work with a rusty scalpel. Trevor, meanwhile, was leaning forward like he was watching the Super Bowl in overtime. The man was practically salivating at the prospect of joining in. "Come on, Drake," he said with that smug grin that made me want to introduce his face to my fist. "If you're really rolling in dough, why don't you show us your bank balance? You know, just to prove you're legit." Show them my bank balance. At a family dinner. In public. Because apparently, my financial privacy was just another casualty in their little entertainment spectacular. The audacity was breathtaking, really. It's like asking someone to drop their pants to prove they're wearing designer underwear. Invasive, humiliating, and completely missing the point. Clara was doing her best impression of someone who'd suddenly gone deaf and blind. She was staring at her plate like it contained the secrets of the universe, occasionally taking tiny sips of champagne that probably tasted like shame at this point. Every few seconds, she'd glance up at me with this look that was half pity, half relief that she wasn't the one in the hot seat. Real supportive, honey. Nothing says "till death do us part," like abandoning ship the second things get rocky. Marcus, not to be outdone by his older siblings, decided to throw his own hat into the ring. "I mean, let's be realistic here," he said with all the wisdom of someone who'd just discovered what a 401k was 6 months ago. "This place probably costs more than most people make in a month. No offense, Drake, but consulting doesn't exactly pay Manhattan money." Consulting. Right. Because that's how I'd introduced myself to this family 3 years ago, and apparently nobody had bothered to ask any follow-up questions since then. I was starting to realize that my attempts at modesty and keeping a low profile had backfired spectacularly. Instead of being seen as humble, I was being written off as broke. Robert was looking increasingly uncomfortable, shifting in his seat like he was sitting on hot coals. The poor guy kept opening his mouth like he wanted to say something, anything, to change the subject, but every time he tried, one of his kids would jump back in with another zinger. It was like watching someone try to referee a cage match, while the fighters kept ignoring the rules. "No, Dad." Bianca snapped when Robert finally managed to mumble something about the weather. "It's time Drake faces reality. We've all been tiptoeing around this for years, pretending like he belongs at tables like this, but enough is enough." Faces reality. Like my entire existence was some kind of delusion that needed to be corrected through public humiliation. The woman had missed her calling as a motivational speaker. You know, the kind that specializes in crushing people's dreams and charging them for the privilege. The humiliation was reaching epic proportions now. I could feel my face burning with embarrassment, that special kind of heat that starts in your chest and radiates outward like a nuclear meltdown. My hands were gripping the edge of the table so hard I was probably leaving fingerprints in the wood. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to either disappear into the floor or start flipping tables, but I was frozen in place like a rabbit caught in headlights. Other tables weren't even pretending to mind their own business anymore. I caught glimpses of people leaning toward each other, whispering behind their hands, probably placing bets on whether I was going to cry or make a run for it. The elegant atmosphere of Lou Bernardine had been transformed into the kind of spectacle you'd expect at a reality TV show taping. Evelyn was maintaining her sphinx-like silence, but her body language was speaking volumes. She was sitting straighter, looking almost satisfied, like she was finally watching justice being served. Her tight little smile had evolved into something that looked dangerously close to vindication. I could practically hear her thinking, "Finally, someone's saying what we've all been thinking." The worst part wasn't even the words themselves. It was the coordinated nature of it all. This wasn't just random family drama. This was a planned execution. They'd been waiting for this moment, probably for months, building up ammunition and waiting for the perfect opportunity to unleash it all at once. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears, drowning out the ambient noise of the restaurant. The beautiful view of Manhattan that had seemed so impressive 20 minutes ago now felt like a reminder of everything I supposedly couldn't afford. The crystal chandeliers looked like they were mocking me, all that expensive beauty highlighting my apparent inadequacy. But you know what they say about cornered animals? Sometimes they bite back. You know that moment in every action movie where the hero's been getting his ass kicked for the entire second act, and then suddenly he reaches for that secret weapon everyone forgot he had? Well, buckle up, Buttercup, because it was showtime. I reached into my wallet with the kind of deliberate calm that comes right before you either save the day or completely humiliate yourself. There's no middle ground in moments like this. You either walk away looking like James Bond, or you become the punchline to a joke that'll get told at family gatherings for the next 20 years. Given my track record with this particular family, the odds weren't exactly in my favor. But here's the thing about being pushed into a corner by a bunch of people who think they know everything about you. Sometimes you've got nothing left to lose. And when you've got nothing to lose, well, that's when things get interesting. My fingers found what I was looking for, and I pulled out my black American Express Centurion card. Not blackish, not dark gray masquerading as black. I'm talking about the real deal. That matte black titanium rectangle that feels like it weighs about as much as a small planet and costs more to obtain than most people spend on a car. I placed it on the table with the kind of casual confidence that I definitely wasn't feeling on the inside, sliding it across the white tablecloth toward our waiter like I was making a bet in some high-stakes poker game. Which, let's be honest, is pretty much exactly what this was. The reaction was immediate and absolutely priceless. First came the gasps. Sharp little intakes of breath from around the table, like someone had just announced that aliens had landed in Times Square. Robert's eyes went wide. Evelyn actually dropped her fork, and Marcus looked like someone had just explained quantum physics to him using interpretive dance. But the best part? The absolute best part was watching the color drain out of Trevor's smug face, like someone had pulled the plug on his arrogance. The man went from looking like the cat who ate the canary to looking like the canary who just realized he was about to become dinner. Then came the scoffs. Because of course there were scoffs. This family couldn't just accept defeat gracefully. No, they had to double down on their skepticism like they were professional card authenticators or something. Bianca recovered first, naturally. The woman had more resilience than a cockroach in a nuclear apocalypse. She threw back her head and laughed. Not just any laugh, mind you, but that particular brand of condescending cackle that she usually reserved for people who pronounced croissant wrong or ordered wine without checking the vintage first. "Oh, please," she said, her voice dripping with the kind of disdain usually reserved for reality TV stars and people who don't use their turn signals. "A fake? How much did you pay for that on eBay? $50? 100? The audacity was stunning, really. Here I was, producing what was essentially the holy grail of credit cards, and she was acting like I'd just tried to pay with Monopoly money. But that's Bianca for you. When faced with evidence that contradicts her worldview, she doesn't adjust her worldview. She just assumes the evidence is fake. Trevor, meanwhile, was nodding along like one of those bobblehead dogs you see in car windows. "Real ones need $250,000 annual spend, Drake," he said, his voice carrying that particular tone of someone who'd just Googled something 5 minutes ago and was now pretending to be an expert. "You're not fooling anyone here. $250,000 annual spend." The man was throwing around numbers like he had any idea what my financial situation actually looked like. For all he knew, I could have been spending that much on coffee and dry cleaning. But no, he was absolutely certain that there was no way someone like me, someone who rented in Queens, someone who did consulting, could possibly have access to that kind of purchasing power. Clara was doing this thing where she was trying to look simultaneously supportive and skeptical, like she couldn't decide whether to back me up or distance herself from what might turn out to be an epic fraud attempt. She kept glancing between me and the card, her forehead wrinkled in confusion. I could practically see the wheels turning in her head. Is my husband actually rich, or is he about to get us all arrested for credit card fraud? The waiter, meanwhile, was standing there holding my card like it might explode. The poor guy was probably thinking he didn't get paid enough to referee whatever family drama was playing out at table 12. He kept looking between me and the card, then at the hostile faces around the table, clearly wondering if he was about to become an unwilling participant in some kind of elaborate prank show. "Full bill, please," I said, my voice steady despite the fact that my heart was doing its best impression of a jackhammer. Inside, I was nervous as hell. Not because I was worried about the card being declined for legitimate reasons, but because there's always that tiny voice in the back of your head that whispers, what if something goes wrong? What if there was some kind of technical glitch? What if the restaurant system was down? What if Mercury was in retrograde and affecting credit card processing equipment? The universe has a twisted sense of humor, and I could just picture it deciding that this would be the perfect moment for some cosmic practical joke. But I kept my expression neutral, channeling every poker player who'd ever lived. If you're going to make a move like this, You don't get to look nervous about it. You own it completely, or you don't do it at all. The silence stretched out like taffy, thick and uncomfortable. Other diners had definitely tuned in to our little drama by now. I could feel their eyes on us like spotlights. Nothing quite like turning your family dinner into performance art for a room full of strangers who were probably wondering if they should start recording with their phones. Robert looked like he was holding his breath, caught somewhere between hope and horror. Marcus had his phone in his hand, probably ready to fact-check whatever happened next. Evelyn was gripping her wine glass, so tight I was worried it might shatter. And there I was, waiting to find out if this gamble was going to pay off, or if I was about to become the most embarrassed man in Manhattan. Sometimes life decides to kick you in the teeth just when you think you're finally about to catch a break. And let me tell you, when that kick comes, it doesn't just hurt. It echoes through your entire soul like a gong being struck by Thor's hammer. The waiter came back looking like he'd just witnessed a puppy getting run over by a garbage truck. His face had gone from the professional neutral expression they teach in fancy restaurant school to something that looked suspiciously like pity mixed with secondhand embarrassment. That's never a good sign, folks. When the guy who deals with drunk Wall Street bros and entitled trust fund babies on a nightly basis looks uncomfortable, you know you're in deep shit. "I'm sorry, sir," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, like he was delivering news of a terminal diagnosis. The card was declined. For simple words that hit me like a meteor strike to the face. The card was declined. The card, my beautiful, legitimate, $100,000 initiation fee Centurion card, was declined. For exactly 1 second, the table went completely silent. Not restaurant quiet. Not polite dinner conversation quiet. I'm talking about the kind of silence that happens right before a nuclear bomb goes off. The kind of silence where you can hear your own heartbeat and the collective intake of breath from everyone around you. And then all hell broke loose. Bianca absolutely lost her mind. I'm talking doubled over, tears streaming down her face. Can't catch her breath level of hysterical laughter. She was laughing so hard she was snorting, which would have been embarrassing for her if she hadn't been too busy enjoying my complete and total humiliation to care about her own dignity. "Oh my God," she managed to gasp between fits of laughter. "Oh my God, I can't. I literally can't." More snorting, more gasping, more of that particular brand of vindictive joy that only comes when someone you dislike falls flat on their face in the most spectacular way possible. Clara, my beloved wife, my partner in life, my supposed ride or die, started chuckling. Not nervous chuckling this time. Actual, genuine amusement. She had this look of relief on her face, like someone had just told her she didn't have cancer after all. Because apparently, the thought of me actually having money was more terrifying to her than watching me get publicly destroyed by her family. "Thank God," she muttered under her breath, probably thinking I couldn't hear her over the sound of my dignity being fed through a wood chipper. "I thought for a second you were actually." She didn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. I knew exactly what she was thinking. Thank God my husband isn't actually successful, because then I'd have to reevaluate everything I thought I knew about him. Trevor was practically glowing with satisfaction. The man looked like he'd just won the lottery and discovered the cure for cancer on the same day. He was leaning back in his chair with this smirk that made me want to introduce his face to the nearest hard surface. "Fake card," he said, shaking his head with mock disappointment. "What a clown. Did you really think we'd fall for that?" He took a long, theatrical sip of his wine, savoring both the vintage and my complete mortification. "I mean, come on, Drake. A Centurion card? You might as well have told us you were secretly Batman." Marcus was shaking his head like a disappointed teacher who'd just caught a student cheating on a test. "Dude," he said, his voice carrying that particular tone of someone who was trying to sound wise, but mostly just sounded condescending. "This is just sad. Like, genuinely sad. Did you really think this would work?" Even Evelyn, who'd been maintaining her sphinx-like silence all evening, finally decided to weigh in. "This is exactly what I feared," she muttered, her voice carrying the weight of 1,000 "I told you so's." Because apparently, she'd been expecting me to pull some kind of financial fraud attempt at her husband's birthday dinner. Nothing says loving mother-in-law like assuming your daughter's husband is a con artist. Robert was the only one who wasn't laughing or gloating. He was just sitting there looking heartbroken, like someone had just told him that puppies weren't real and Christmas was canceled forever. "Drake," he whispered, his voice full of disappointment and something that might have been pity. That whisper hit me harder than all the laughter combined. This man, who I genuinely respected and cared about, was looking at me like I'd just betrayed everything he believed about decency and honesty. The hurt in his eyes was like a knife to the chest, twisting with every second that passed. Their laughter was echoing in my ears, bouncing around inside my skull like a pinball machine from hell. Each cackle, each snort, each satisfied chuckle was another nail in the coffin of whatever dignity I'd walked into this restaurant with. I could feel the stares from other tables now. Not the curious glances from earlier, but the kind of uncomfortable gawking that happens when someone's life implodes in public. The beautiful restaurant that had seemed so elegant 20 minutes ago now felt like a coliseum, and I was the Christian being fed to the lions. The chandeliers that had sparkled so appealingly were now spotlights, highlighting my humiliation for everyone to see. The Manhattan skyline visible through those floor-to-ceiling windows might as well have been laughing at me, too. I kept my face perfectly still, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing me break. Inside, I was dying 1,000 deaths, but on the outside, I maintained that poker face like my life depended on it. Because sometimes, when everything's going to hell around you, the only dignity you have left is the dignity you refuse to surrender. My hands were clenched so tight under the table that my knuckles were probably white as snow. Every muscle in my body was tense, coiled like a spring that was about to snap. The embarrassment was so intense, it was almost physical, like someone had poured boiling water over my entire body and then rolled me in salt. But here's the thing about rock bottom. Sometimes, when you think you can't fall any further, the universe decides to show you just how wrong you can be. And sometimes, just sometimes, that's when the real surprises begin. You know how in movies, right when the hero's about to get executed by the bad guys, the cavalry comes charging over the hill with trumpets blaring and flags waving? Well, real life doesn't usually work that way. In real life, when you're getting your ass handed to you by your in-laws at an overpriced restaurant, you're pretty much on your own. Except when you're not. The laughter was still echoing around our table like some kind of twisted symphony of schadenfreude when the restaurant's main doors suddenly opened with more urgency than your typical late dinner arrival. And let me tell you, after the evening I'd been having, I was expecting maybe another rich couple coming in to witness my public humiliation, or perhaps the ghost of my dignity making one final appearance before departing for the afterlife. What I wasn't expecting was Thomas Chin. Thomas fucking Chin, the general manager of Lou Bernardine, came rushing through that door like his hair was on fire and his ass was catching. The man was practically power walking across the dining room, weaving between tables with the kind of focused determination usually reserved for emergency room doctors or parents chasing after escaped toddlers. Now, here's something you need to understand about Thomas. This guy doesn't rush for anyone. I'd worked with him on events before, and the man had the kind of unflappable composure that made Buddhist monks look emotionally unstable. He could handle a kitchen fire, a food poisoning scare, and a celebrity meltdown all in the same evening without breaking a sweat. So seeing him moving with this kind of urgency, that was like seeing a unicorn wearing a three-piece suit. He was slightly breathless when he reached our table, which should have been my first clue that something was about to go very, very differently than anyone expected. The second clue was the way he completely ignored everyone else at the table and came straight to me. "Mr. Anderson," he said, his voice carrying that particular tone of professional panic that happens when someone realizes they've screwed up in a big way. "I'm terribly sorry. Mr. Anderson." Not sir. Not excuse me. Mr. Anderson. Like he knew exactly who I was and exactly why he was there. The formality was deliberate, the kind of respect you show to someone whose business you very much don't want to lose. Bianca's laughter cut off like someone had hit the mute button on her vocal cords. Trevor's smug grin froze on his face like it had been flash frozen in liquid nitrogen. Clara's relieved chuckling died in her throat, replaced by a look of confusion that would have been comical if I hadn't been too busy trying to process what was happening to appreciate the irony. The silence that followed was different from the earlier one. Before, it had been the silence of anticipation, everyone waiting to see how I'd react to my humiliation. This silence was heavier, loaded with the sudden realization that maybe, just maybe, they'd all been operating under some very incorrect assumptions. Thomas was still talking, apparently oblivious to the family drama he'd just walked into. Your card didn't process because our accounting department flagged it, he continued, his words coming out in a rush like he was trying to deliver bad news as quickly as possible to minimize the damage. We still owe you $500,000 from last month's catering contracts. $500,000. From last month's catering contracts. The words hung in the air like smoke from a nuclear explosion, settling over our table with the kind of weight that changes everything. Not $500. Not $5,000. $500,000. The kind of money that most people don't see in their entire lifetimes, just sitting there in some accounting department's ledger, waiting to be transferred to my business account. The effect on my family was instantaneous and absolutely fucking beautiful. Bianca's face went through more color changes than a mood ring in a tumble dryer. She started at her normal shade of self-satisfied pink, went white as fresh snow, then shifted to a sickly green that made her look like she was about to lose her expensive dinner all over the white tablecloth. Her mouth was hanging open like someone had removed all the bones from her jaw. Trevor's wine glass had stopped halfway to his lips, suspended in midair like he'd been frozen by some kind of cosmic pause button. His eyes were doing this thing where they kept darting between me and Thomas, like he was watching a tennis match played at light speed. The smug confidence that had been radiating off him like cheap cologne had evaporated completely, replaced by the kind of deer-in-headlights expression you see on people who've just realized they've been talking shit about their boss while their boss was standing right behind them. Clara was blinking rapidly, like someone had just shined a flashlight directly into her eyes. She kept opening and closing her mouth, reminding me of a fish that had been yanked out of water and was trying to figure out how breathing worked. The relief that had been written all over her face just moments before had been replaced by something that looked suspiciously like panic. Marcus had gone completely rigid, sitting there like someone had just told him that everything he'd learned in business school was wrong and he needed to start over from kindergarten. His phone was still in his hand, but he was staring at Thomas like the man had just materialized from another dimension. Even Evelyn, the queen of maintaining composure in all situations, was showing cracks in her armor. Her carefully maintained expression of maternal disappointment had shifted into something that looked dangerously close to shock. Her wine glass was trembling slightly in her hand, creating tiny ripples on the surface of the liquid. Robert was the only one who looked more confused than horrified. The poor guy was glancing around the table like he was trying to solve a puzzle that kept changing shape every time he looked at it. 500,000, he repeated quietly, his voice trailing off like he wasn't sure he'd heard correctly. Thomas, meanwhile, was still in full damage control mode, apparently unaware that he'd just detonated a nuclear bomb in the middle of a family dinner. The delay was entirely on our end, he continued, his professional training kicking in even as he delivered information that was rewriting everyone's understanding of reality. Our new accounting software flagged the transaction as unusual due to the amount, and it's been sitting in a verification queue for the past 3 weeks. 3 weeks. My money had been sitting in their system for 3 weeks, while their computer system played 20 questions with my bank account. Under normal circumstances, I would have been annoyed about the delay. Right now, though, I was feeling nothing but gratitude for whatever software glitch had created this moment. The waiter who had delivered my earlier humiliation was now standing behind Thomas, holding my card like it was made of plutonium. His face had gone from apologetic to horrified as he realized he'd just told a major client that his card was declined due to a processing error on their end. The poor guy looked like he was calculating how much his tip was going to suffer because of this screw-up. Other diners in the restaurant had definitely tuned in to our drama by now. The couple at the table next to us had completely abandoned any pretense of minding their own business and were openly staring. The group of business executives 3 tables over had stopped their conversation mid-sentence. Even the staff members who weren't directly involved were sneaking glances in our direction. But I wasn't focused on them. I was focused on the faces of my family members as they slowly processed the implications of what Thomas had just said. You could practically see the gears turning in their heads, recalculating everything they thought they knew about me, everything they'd assumed about my financial situation, everything they'd just spent the last hour mocking me for. The beautiful thing about moments like this is that they don't just change what people think about you. They reveal what they actually think about themselves. And judging by the expressions around our table, my dear family members were having some very uncomfortable realizations about their own assumptions and prejudices. Thomas finally paused his explanation and seemed to notice the stunned silence that had fallen over our table. He glanced around at the shell-shocked faces, his professional instincts probably telling him that he'd walked into something more complicated than a simple billing error. "Is everything all right?" he asked, his voice carrying that careful neutrality that service industry professionals use when they sense they've stepped into a minefield but aren't sure where the explosives are buried. "Everything all right?" That was like asking if the Titanic had experienced a minor scheduling delay. Nothing about this evening had been all right from the moment Bianca opened her mouth, but now things were about to get very interesting indeed. You know that moment in poker when you've been playing your cards close to your chest all night, letting everyone think you're some amateur who wandered in from the street, and then you finally lay down a royal flush? That moment when you watch the blood drain from everyone's faces as they realize they've been playing checkers while you were playing chess? Well, welcome to my moment, folks. The silence at our table was so thick you could have cut it with a chainsaw. 8 people sitting around one of Manhattan's most expensive restaurants, and the only sound was the gentle clinking of cutlery from other tables and the distant hum of kitchen activity. Everyone was staring at me like I'd just announced I was actually an alien from Mars who'd been studying human behavior for the past 3 years. I took a slow sip of my champagne, Dom Perignon, which suddenly seemed a lot less expensive considering what Thomas had just revealed, and set the glass down with deliberate calm. "Time to pull back the curtain on this whole charade. I think there's been some confusion," I said, my voice steady despite the fact that my heart was doing backflips in my chest. "See, I'm not just Clara's husband who does some consulting on the side." The words came out easier than I'd expected. Maybe it was the adrenaline. Maybe it was the 3 years of pent-up frustration finally finding an outlet. Or maybe it was just the pure satisfaction of watching Bianca's face cycle through more emotions than a soap opera marathon. "I'm the founder and CEO of Anderson Events," I continued, letting each word land with the weight it deserved. "We're the largest luxury event planning and catering company on the East Coast." Anderson Events, the name that had been plastered across Forbes, Wall Street Journal, and every major business publication in the Northeast for the past 5 years. The company that handled everything from Fortune 500 corporate galas to diplomatic receptions that made international news. The business that had grown from me working out of a studio apartment in Brooklyn to employing over 200 people across 6 states. Bianca's mouth was opening and closing like a goldfish that had forgotten how breathing worked. The woman who'd spent the last hour tearing me apart was suddenly looking like someone had just explained quantum physics to her using interpretive dance. Her perfectly applied makeup couldn't hide the fact that all the color had drained from her face, leaving her looking like a glamorous ghost. "We handle corporate galas for companies you've probably heard of," I said, warming to my subject now that the floodgates were open. "Fortune 500 parties, diplomatic receptions, celebrity weddings where the guest list reads like a who's who of American politics and entertainment." Trevor was doing this thing where he was trying to look skeptical while simultaneously pulling out his phone to fact-check what I was saying. The man's fingers were moving across his screen like he was typing for his life, probably Googling Anderson Events faster than a conspiracy theorist researching government cover-ups. "The UN's anniversary celebration last month?" I said, letting a small smile play at the corners of my mouth. "The one that was featured on every major news network, with world leaders flying in from 6 different continents? That was us. The UN anniversary celebration. The event that had made international headlines, not just for the political significance, but for the sheer scale and elegance of the production. 1,200 guests, including heads of state, Nobel Prize winners, and celebrities who normally couldn't be in the same room without starting Twitter wars. It had taken 8 months to plan and coordinate, and the final bill had come to just over $3 million. Marcus was staring at me like I'd just told him I was secretly Superman. His business school education was probably short-circuiting as he tried to reconcile the consultant he'd been condescending to all evening with the CEO of a company that probably generated more revenue in a month than he'd see in his entire career. "But that's impossible," Clara whispered, her voice barely audible over the ambient noise of the restaurant. You never said. I mean, you always told us you did consulting. Consulting, right. Because 3 years ago, when I was still building the company and working 18-hour days, consulting had seemed like an easier explanation than trying to describe what I actually did. Event planning sounded small time, like I was organizing birthday parties for suburban moms. Corporate consulting sounded respectable, professional, the kind of thing that wouldn't raise too many questions at family dinners. I did consulting, I said, meeting Clara's confused gaze. For about 6 months, right after college. Then I started Anderson Events in my studio apartment with a $5,000 business loan and a laptop that crashed every time I tried to run Excel. $5,000. That's what it had taken to start the empire I'd built. $5,000 that I'd borrowed from a credit union, spent on business cards, a decent website, and enough coffee to keep me awake for the first 3 months while I cold called every corporate event manager in New York City. Robert was leaning forward now, his earlier disappointment replaced by something that looked like fascination mixed with pride. Son, he said quietly, are you telling us you've been running a major company this whole time? Son. He'd called me son. In 3 years of marriage to his daughter, Robert had never once used that word with me. It had always been Drake or young man, or, when he was feeling particularly formal, my daughter's husband. But now, suddenly, I was son. We generated $42 million in revenue last year, I said, the numbers rolling off my tongue like they were discussing the weather. We've got offices in Manhattan, Boston, Philadelphia, and we're opening in D.C. next month. $42 million. The kind of number that most people only see in lottery jackpots or celebrity divorce settlements. Revenue that put us in the same league as companies that had been around for decades, not a business that had started in a Brooklyn studio apartment less than 6 years ago. Trevor had found something on his phone and was staring at the screen like it contained the secrets of the universe. His face had gone through several color changes, finally settling on a shade that reminded me of old newspaper. Forbes, he said quietly, his voice carrying the tone of someone who'd just discovered that gravity worked backwards. Forbes ranked you as one of New York's most influential event planners under 40. Forbes. The article that had come out 8 months ago, complete with a photo shoot in our Manhattan office and a 2-page spread detailing how I'd built Anderson Events from nothing into one of the most sought-after event companies in the country. The article that had resulted in phone calls from Hollywood producers, tech billionaires, and at least 3 foreign governments wanting to discuss potential opportunities. Net worth estimated at $28 million. Trevor continued reading, his voice getting quieter with each word. Known for handling high-profile corporate events and celebrity weddings, regularly works with Fortune 500 companies and government agencies. $28 million. The number hung in the air like incense, heavy and impossible to ignore. It wasn't exactly accurate. The Forbes estimates were always a bit inflated, and they didn't account for business expenses and reinvestment. But it was close enough to make everyone at the table recalculate everything they thought they knew about their financial pecking order. Evelyn was gripping her wine glass so tight I was genuinely worried it might shatter. The woman who'd spent 3 years treating me like an unfortunate mistake her daughter had made was suddenly looking at me like I was a completely different species. Her carefully maintained expression of maternal concern had cracked completely, replaced by something that looked suspiciously like awe mixed with a healthy dose of embarrassment. Marcus was doing math in his head, probably trying to figure out how someone who was supposedly broke could afford to drop $3,000 on a birthday dinner without blinking. His fresh MBA was probably telling him that the numbers didn't add up, but the evidence was sitting right there in front of him in the form of Thomas Chin and a $500,000 accounting error. We handle about 300 events per year, I continued, enjoying the way everyone was hanging on my every word now. Corporate retreats, product launches, merger celebrations, diplomatic functions. Last month, we coordinated a tech conference in Silicon Valley for 15,000 attendees. The month before that, we handled a pharmaceutical company's IPO celebration that had a guest list that read like a Fortune 500 directory. The transformation in their faces was absolutely incredible. These were the same people who'd been laughing at me 20 minutes ago, The same family members who'd spent the evening treating me like an embarrassing charity case who'd somehow conned their daughter into marriage. Now they were looking at me like I was some kind of business deity who'd been hiding in plain sight. "But why didn't you tell us?" Clara asked, her voice carrying a mixture of confusion and something that might have been hurt. "Why let us think you were just what? Just a small-time consultant who could barely afford rent? Just some loser who'd gotten lucky when their daughter had felt sorry for him? Just a guy who was punching above his weight class and needed to be reminded of his place in the world? Because I wanted to be loved for who I am," I said simply, the words carrying more weight than I'd intended. "Not for what I have in my bank account." The honesty of it seemed to hit everyone at once. Here I was, a guy who could afford to buy most of the restaurants in Manhattan, who'd been pretending to be broke for 3 years just to see if his wife's family would accept him for himself rather than his net worth. And judging by the evening's events, I'd gotten my answer. Chapter 8, their reactions. You know how they say a picture's worth 1,000 words? Well, the faces around our table were writing entire novels. And let me tell you, they were bestsellers in the genre of holy shit, we really screwed this one up. Each person was processing the revelation in their own special way, like watching a psychological experiment in real time. Robert was experiencing what I can only describe as emotional whiplash. The man was cycling through emotions faster than a slot machine, and I could practically see him rewinding the entire evening in his head, recontextualizing every snide comment and condescending look through the lens of what he now knew. His face was a masterpiece of conflicting feelings: pride at having a successful son-in-law, guilt for not defending me earlier, and what looked suspiciously like the dawning realization that he'd been treating a multimillionaire like a charity case for 3 years. "My son-in-law," he whispered, the words coming out like he was testing how they sounded. But it wasn't just the words, it was the way he said them, with this mixture of wonder and regret that made my chest tight. This was a man who'd built his own accounting firm from nothing, who understood what it meant to struggle and sacrifice for success, and he was realizing that I'd done the same thing while his family treated me like garbage. He kept shaking his head, not in disbelief, but in what looked like self-recrimination. "All this time," he muttered, "all this time, and I never asked the right questions. I just assumed." His voice trailed off, but I knew what he was thinking. He'd assumed what everyone else had assumed, that his daughter had married some loser who was punching above his weight class. The guilt was written all over his face now. This was a man who prided himself on being fair, on giving people the benefit of the doubt, and he was realizing that he'd failed his own standards when it came to me. Every family dinner where he'd stayed silent while his daughters tore me apart, every time he'd let their comments slide, every moment he could have stood up for me, but didn't. It was all coming back to haunt him now. Evelyn, on the other hand, was going through her own special brand of psychological crisis. The woman who'd perfected the art of the passive-aggressive slight was suddenly looking like someone had just told her that water was actually dry and the sky was purple. Her carefully maintained composure was cracking like ice in the spring thaw, revealing something underneath that looked suspiciously like panic. For 3 years, she'd been operating under the assumption that her daughter had made a mistake, that Clara had settled for some small-time consultant who was lucky to be invited to family gatherings. Evelyn's entire worldview was built on social hierarchies and status markers, and suddenly she was realizing that she'd been treating someone who significantly outranked her in the financial food chain like he was beneath her notice. Her wine glass was trembling in her hand, creating tiny ripples that caught the light from those expensive chandeliers. She kept opening her mouth like she wanted to say something, then closing it again when she realized she had no idea how to navigate this new reality. How do you apologize for 3 years of condescension to someone who could probably buy your house with his quarterly bonus? I had no idea, she finally managed, her voice smaller than I'd ever heard it. The woman who usually spoke with the authority of someone accustomed to being the most important person in the room was suddenly sounding like a schoolchild who'd been caught cheating on a test. But the real show was happening with Bianca. Oh, sweet Bianca, who'd spent the entire evening playing prosecutor, judge, and jury in the case against my financial credibility. She was experiencing what psychologists probably have a fancy term for, but I prefer to call it the complete and total destruction of one's superiority complex in real time. The woman had gone from triumphant to horrified to what looked like she was having an existential crisis about her place in the universe. Her perfectly applied makeup couldn't hide the fact that she looked like she'd been hit by a truck carrying a load of embarrassment and shame. She kept staring at me like I was a completely different person, which, in fairness, I suppose I was from her perspective. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, the words coming out like they were being dragged from her throat with pliers. This was a woman who probably hadn't apologized for anything more serious than stepping on someone's toe in the past decade. And here she was trying to figure out how to make amends for an evening's worth of character assassination. The humiliation was radiating off her like heat from a furnace. Every cruel comment, every mocking laugh, every condescending look, it was all playing back in her head like a highlight reel of her own worst behavior. She was realizing that she'd spent the evening publicly destroying someone who was successful enough to make her entire family look like small-time players. "I didn't know," she said again, her voice barely audible over the ambient noise of the restaurant. We all thought." She couldn't finish the sentence, probably because finishing it would require admitting just how wrong they'd all been about me. Trevor was having his own special moment of reckoning. The man who'd been so confident about calling me out for having a fake credit card was now holding his phone like it contained evidence of his own stupidity. He'd found the Forbes article, probably along with a dozen other business publications that had featured stories about Anderson events over the past 2 years. His face was cycling through emotions like a broken traffic light: confusion, embarrassment, what looked like genuine fear about how badly he'd screwed up. This was a guy who worked in middle management at some insurance company, and he was suddenly realizing he'd spent the evening trash-talking someone who was probably more successful than his entire company's board of directors. "Jesus Christ," he muttered, scrolling through what I assumed were search results about my company. "The White House. You handled events at the fucking White House." His voice carried the tone of someone who was realizing that he'd been playing checkers while everyone else was playing three-dimensional chess. The fear in his eyes was particularly satisfying. This wasn't just embarrassment about being wrong. This was the dawning realization that he'd potentially made an enemy of someone who had connections and resources he couldn't even imagine. In his world of corporate politics and office hierarchies, pissing off the wrong person could be career suicide, and he was probably wondering if I was the type to hold grudges. Marcus, meanwhile, was going through what I can only describe as an academic crisis. The kid had come out of business school thinking he understood how the world worked, armed with case studies and theoretical knowledge about entrepreneurship and business development. But here was a real-life example sitting right across from him. Someone who'd built a multi-million-dollar empire while he was still figuring out how student loans worked. His phone was in his hand, and I could see him frantically Googling everything he could find about Anderson events. The poor kid looked like someone had just told him that everything he'd learned in school was theoretical bullshit, and the real world operated according to completely different rules. "You out-earned all of us combined," he whispered, his voice carrying the tone of someone who was recalculating his entire understanding of success and achievement. The cocky confidence that had been radiating off him earlier had evaporated completely, replaced by something that looked like genuine awe mixed with a healthy dose of embarrassment. He kept glancing between his phone screen and me, like he was trying to reconcile the person sitting across from him with the business mogul he was reading about. The cognitive dissonance was practically visible. How could the guy they'd been treating like a charity case all evening be the same person who'd been featured on the cover of Business Week? But Clara's reaction was the most complex of all. My wife, the woman who'd promised to love me for richer or poorer, in good times and bad, was looking at me like I was a stranger she'd never seen before. The confusion in her eyes was heartbreaking, but it was mixed with something else that looked suspiciously like betrayal. She'd been complicit in her family's treatment of me, laughing along with their jokes, staying silent when they tore me apart. And now she was realizing that while she thought she was married to some small-time consultant who was lucky to afford their Queens apartment, she'd actually been married to someone who could have bought them a penthouse in Manhattan without blinking. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked, her voice carrying a mixture of hurt and confusion that made my chest tight. "I'm your wife. Why would you keep something like this from me?" The question hung in the air like smoke, heavy with implications about trust and honesty and what it meant to really know someone. She was realizing that the man she'd been married to for 3 years had been keeping a secret that fundamentally changed everything about their relationship, their future, their entire life together. But here's the thing about secrets. Sometimes you keep them not because you don't trust someone, but because you want to see who they really are when they think there's nothing to gain from being kind to you. And tonight, I'd gotten my answer about who my wife's family really was when they thought I was nobody special. The waiter appeared again, carrying a fresh bottle of champagne. "Compliments of the house, Mr. Anderson," he said with the kind of respect that money commands. The title felt different now, spoken in front of my family. Not just polite formality, but acknowledgement of status and success. Everyone at the table was staring at me like I was an exhibit in a museum, trying to process this new version of reality where the person they'd been treating like garbage was actually more successful than any of them had ever dreamed of being. You know how they say a picture's worth 1,000 words? Well, the faces around our table were writing entire novels. And let me tell you, they were bestsellers in the genre of holy shit, we really screwed this one up. Each person was processing the revelation in their own special way, like watching a psychological experiment in real time. Robert was experiencing what I can only describe as emotional whiplash. The man was cycling through emotions faster than a slot machine, and I could practically see him rewinding the entire evening in his head, recontextualizing every snide comment and condescending look through the lens of what he now knew. His face was a masterpiece of conflicting feelings: pride at having a successful son-in-law, guilt for not defending me earlier, and what looked suspiciously like the dawning realization that he'd been treating a multimillionaire like a charity case for 3 years. "My son-in-law," he whispered, the words coming out like he was testing how they sounded. But it wasn't just the words, it was the way he said them, with this mixture of wonder and regret that made my chest tight. This was a man who'd built his own accounting firm from nothing, who understood what it meant to struggle and sacrifice for success. And he was realizing that I'd done the same thing while his family treated me like garbage. He kept shaking his head, not in disbelief, but in what looked like self-recrimination. "All this time," he muttered, "all this time, and I never asked the right questions. I just assumed." His voice trailed off, but I knew what he was thinking. He'd assumed what everyone else had assumed, that his daughter had married some loser who was punching above his weight class. The guilt was written all over his face now. This was a man who prided himself on being fair, on giving people the benefit of the doubt, and he was realizing that he'd failed his own standards when it came to me. Every family dinner where he'd stayed silent while his daughters tore me apart, every time he'd let their comments slide, every moment he could have stood up for me, but didn't, it was all coming back to haunt him now. Evelyn, on the other hand, was going through her own special brand of psychological crisis. The woman who'd perfected the art of the passive-aggressive slight was suddenly looking like someone had just told her that water was actually dry and the sky was purple. Her carefully maintained composure was cracking like ice in the spring thaw, revealing something underneath that looked suspiciously like panic. For 3 years, she'd been operating under the assumption that her daughter had made a mistake, that Clara had settled for some small-time consultant who was lucky to be invited to family gatherings. Evelyn's entire worldview was built on social hierarchies and status markers, and suddenly she was realizing that she'd been treating someone who significantly outranked her in the financial food chain like he was beneath her notice. Her wine glass was trembling in her hand, creating tiny ripples that caught the light from those expensive chandeliers. She kept opening her mouth like she wanted to say something, then closing it again when she realized she had no idea how to navigate this new reality. How do you apologize for 3 years of condescension to someone who could probably buy your house with his quarterly bonus? I had no idea, she finally managed, her voice smaller than I'd ever heard it. The woman who usually spoke with the authority of someone accustomed to being the most important person in the room was suddenly sounding like a schoolchild who'd been caught cheating on a test. But the real show was happening with Bianca. Oh, sweet Bianca, who'd spent the entire evening playing prosecutor, judge, and jury in the case against my financial credibility. She was experiencing what psychologists probably have a fancy term for, but I prefer to call it the complete and total destruction of one's superiority complex in real time. The woman had gone from triumphant to horrified to what looked like she was having an existential crisis about her place in the universe. Her perfectly applied makeup couldn't hide the fact that she looked like she'd been hit by a truck carrying a load of embarrassment and shame. She kept staring at me like I was a completely different person, which, in fairness, I suppose I was from her perspective. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, the words coming out like they were being dragged from her throat with pliers. This was a woman who probably hadn't apologized for anything more serious than stepping on someone's toe in the past decade. And here she was trying to figure out how to make amends for an evening's worth of character assassination. The humiliation was radiating off her like heat from a furnace. Every cruel comment, every mocking laugh, every condescending look, it was all playing back in her head like a highlight reel of her own worst behavior. She was realizing that she'd spent the evening publicly destroying someone who was successful enough to make her entire family look like small-time players. "I didn't know," she said again, her voice barely audible over the ambient noise of the restaurant. We all thought." She couldn't finish the sentence, probably because finishing it would require admitting just how wrong they'd all been about me. Trevor was having his own special moment of reckoning. The man who'd been so confident about calling me out for having a fake credit card was now holding his phone like it contained evidence of his own stupidity. He'd found the Forbes article, probably along with a dozen other business publications that had featured stories about Anderson events over the past 2 years. His face was cycling through emotions like a broken traffic light: confusion, embarrassment, what looked like genuine fear about how badly he'd screwed up. This was a guy who worked in middle management at some insurance company, and he was suddenly realizing he'd spent the evening trash-talking someone who was probably more successful than his entire company's board of directors. "Jesus Christ," he muttered, scrolling through what I assumed were search results about my company. "The White House. You handled events at the fucking White House." His voice carried the tone of someone who was realizing that he'd been playing checkers while everyone else was playing three-dimensional chess. The fear in his eyes was particularly satisfying. This wasn't just embarrassment about being wrong. This was the dawning realization that he'd potentially made an enemy of someone who had connections and resources he couldn't even imagine. In his world of corporate politics and office hierarchies, pissing off the wrong person could be career suicide, and he was probably wondering if I was the type to hold grudges. Marcus, meanwhile, was going through what I can only describe as an academic crisis. The kid had come out of business school thinking he understood how the world worked, armed with case studies and theoretical knowledge about entrepreneurship and business development. But here was a real-life example sitting right across from him. Someone who'd built a multi-million-dollar empire while he was still figuring out how student loans worked. His phone was in his hand, and I could see him frantically Googling everything he could find about Anderson events. The poor kid looked like someone had just told him that everything he'd learned in school was theoretical bullshit, and the real world operated according to completely different rules. "You out-earned all of us combined," he whispered, his voice carrying the tone of someone who was recalculating his entire understanding of success and achievement. The cocky confidence that had been radiating off him earlier had evaporated completely, replaced by something that looked like genuine awe mixed with a healthy dose of embarrassment. He kept glancing between his phone's screen and me, like he was trying to reconcile the person sitting across from him with the business mogul he was reading about. The cognitive dissonance was practically visible. How could the guy they'd been treating like a charity case all evening be the same person who'd been featured on the cover of Business Week? But Clara's reaction was the most complex of all. My wife, the woman who'd promised to love me for richer or poorer, in good times and bad, was looking at me like I was a stranger she'd never seen before. The confusion in her eyes was heartbreaking, but it was mixed with something else that looked suspiciously like betrayal. She'd been complicit in her family's treatment of me, laughing along with their jokes, staying silent when they tore me apart. And now she was realizing that while she thought she was married to some small-time consultant who was lucky to afford their Queens apartment, she'd actually been married to someone who could have bought them a penthouse in Manhattan without blinking. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked, her voice carrying a mixture of hurt and confusion that made my chest tight. "I'm your wife. Why would you keep something like this from me?" The question hung in the air like smoke, heavy with implications about trust and honesty and what it meant to really know someone. She was realizing that the man she'd been married to for 3 years had been keeping a secret that fundamentally changed everything about their relationship, their future, their entire life together. But here's the thing about secrets. Sometimes you keep them not because you don't trust someone, but because you want to see who they really are when they think there's nothing to gain from being kind to you. And tonight, I'd gotten my answer about who my wife's family really was when they thought I was nobody special. The waiter appeared again, carrying a fresh bottle of champagne. "Compliments of the house, Mr. Anderson," he said with the kind of respect that money commands. The title felt different now, spoken in front of my family. Not just polite formality, but acknowledgement of status and success. Everyone at the table was staring at me like I was an exhibit in a museum, trying to process this new version of reality where the person they'd been treating like garbage was actually more successful than any of them had ever dreamed of being. You know that moment when you're standing at the edge of a cliff and you have to decide whether to jump or step back? Well, I'd been standing on that emotional precipice for 3 years, and tonight I finally took the leap. The question hanging in the air, why I'd kept it all secret, deserved more than a simple answer. It deserved the truth, even if that truth was going to hurt. I took a long look around the table, at these people who'd spent the evening treating me like I was some kind of charity case, and felt something shift inside my chest. Not anger, exactly, but a deep sadness that had been building for 3 years. The sadness of watching people you want to love show you exactly who they are when they think there's nothing to gain from being decent to you. "I wanted to be loved for who I am," I said, my voice steadier than I felt inside. "Not for the money. I wanted to build something real with this family, something that wasn't based on bank statements or status symbols." The words came out heavier than I'd intended, carrying the weight of every family dinner where I'd bitten my tongue, every casual insult I'd absorbed, every moment I'd wondered if this was what belonging to a family was supposed to feel like. 3 years of watching people I desperately wanted to accept me treat me like I was beneath their notice, and all because I'd made the mistake of thinking character mattered more than credit scores. Clara was staring at me with this expression that was part confusion, part hurt, and part something that might have been recognition. "But Drake," she said, her voice small in the expensive quiet of the restaurant, "I would have loved you anyway. Money doesn't change how I feel about you. Doesn't change how you feel. Right?" Except for the part where she'd spent the evening laughing along with her family's jokes about my supposed poverty, staying silent while they tore me apart, looking relieved when my card got declined. If money didn't matter to her, why had she seemed so comfortable with her family's assumption that I wasn't good enough for their precious daughter? "Would you have?" I asked, and the question hung in the air like a challenge. "Because from where I'm sitting, it seems like you were pretty comfortable with your family's version of who I was. You never once defended me, Clara. Not once in 3 years." The accusation hit her like a physical blow. I could see it in the way her shoulders sagged, the way her eyes dropped to the table. She knew I was right, and knowing it was written all over her face like guilt in neon letters. I described the late nights. I continued, my voice cracking slightly as the emotions I'd been holding back for years finally found their outlet. The endless sacrifices, the pressure of running a company with 200 employees who depend on me for their livelihoods. Do you have any idea what it's like to carry that kind of responsibility? 200 employees. 200 families whose mortgages and groceries and children's college funds depended on the decisions I made every single day. 200 people who trusted me to keep the company growing, to keep the clients happy, to make sure their paychecks cleared on time. The weight of it was crushing sometimes, especially in those early days when one lost client could have meant laying off half my staff. Robert was leaning forward now, his businessman's instincts finally kicking in. 200 employees, he repeated, his voice carrying the tone of someone who was beginning to understand the scope of what I'd built. As someone who'd run his own company, he knew what those numbers meant in terms of responsibility and stress. I started with nothing, I said, the memories flooding back like a dam had burst. A $5,000 loan from a credit union, a laptop that crashed every time I tried to run multiple programs, and a studio apartment in Brooklyn that was smaller than most people's closets. I worked 18-hour days for the first 2 years, eating ramen noodles and instant coffee because every dollar I had was going back into the business. The early days. God, the early days had been brutal. I'd been living on 3 hours of sleep and pure caffeine, cold calling corporate event managers during the day and designing proposals late into the night. There were weeks when I wasn't sure if I was going to make rent, let alone build something sustainable. But I kept pushing because I could see the potential, could envision what the company could become if I just worked hard enough and smart enough and refused to give up. I built Anderson Events from the ground up. I continued, my voice stronger now as I talked about the thing I was most proud of. Every client relationship, every successful event, every expansion into a new market. I earned it. No family connections, no inherited wealth, no shortcuts. Just work and determination and probably way too much coffee. Bianca was staring at me with this expression that was part awe, part horror. The woman who'd spent the evening mocking me for pretending to have money was slowly realizing that I'd actually earned more money than her entire extended family combined. And I'd done it while she was, what? Working part-time at some boutique and living off Trevor's middle management salary? But the fear, I said, my voice dropping to almost a whisper. The biggest fear I had was that you'd only respect me once you saw numbers in a bank account. That all the relationship building, all the attempts to connect with this family as people, would be meaningless once you found out about the money. There it was. The truth I'd been carrying around like a stone in my chest for 3 years. The fear that had kept me silent through every insult, every condescending comment, every moment when I'd wanted to scream at them to show me some basic human decency. I was terrified, I admitted, and saying it out loud felt like lancing a wound that had been festering for years. Terrified that the moment you found out about Anderson Events, about the success, about the money, everything would change. That suddenly I'd be worthy of respect not because of who I am as a person, but because of what I have in my investment portfolio. The silence that followed was different from the earlier silences. This one was heavy with understanding, with the weight of 3 years of miscommunication and missed opportunities. Everyone was processing what I'd said, trying to reconcile their assumptions with this new reality. Evelyn was the first to speak, her voice small and shaky. I never meant to make you feel that way, she said. But even as the words came out, we both knew they weren't entirely true. She had meant to make me feel small, to remind me of my place in the family hierarchy. The only difference was that she'd been operating with completely wrong information about what that place actually was. I wanted to know if you could love me when you thought I was nobody special, I said, looking directly at Clara. I wanted to know if this family could accept me based on my character, my values, the way I treated your daughter. I wanted to build relationships that weren't based on what I could do for you financially. And there was the heart of it. 3 years of being treated like garbage by people who were supposed to become my family, all because they thought I wasn't successful enough to deserve their respect. 3 years of watching them show me exactly who they were when they thought there was nothing to gain from being kind to me. Marcus was shaking his head, looking like someone had just explained that everything he believed about the world was wrong. Dude, he said, his business school vocabulary apparently failing him in the face of this revelation. That's actually kind of genius. Like, from a psychological standpoint, you basically conducted a 3-year experiment in human nature. A 3-year experiment in human nature. That was one way to put it, though it made it sound more clinical than it had felt. Living it had been more like slow torture, watching people I wanted to love treat me like I was beneath their notice, all while knowing I could have changed their entire attitude with a single bank statement. But the pressure, I continued, my voice cracking again as I thought about all the nights I'd lain awake wondering if I was making the right choice. The pressure of running a company this size, of being responsible for so many people's livelihoods, of making decisions that affect hundreds of families, it's crushing sometimes. And I had to carry all of that alone, because I couldn't tell any of you about it. The isolation had been the worst part. Having this huge part of my life that I couldn't share with the people who were supposed to be closest to me. Coming home from board meetings with Fortune 500 executives and having to pretend I'd spent the day doing small-time consulting work. Celebrating major business victories in private because I couldn't explain why a simple consultant would be landing million-dollar contracts. Robert's eyes were softer now, filled with what looked like genuine remorse. Son, he said, and there was that word again, carrying more weight than it had before. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I should have seen. He should have seen what? That I was more than what they assumed? That I deserved basic respect regardless of my income level? That maybe, just maybe, their daughter had actually made a good choice in marrying me? The worst part, I said, my voice barely above a whisper now, was wondering every single day if I was wrong. If maybe character doesn't actually matter, and all that counts in this world is what you can afford to put on the table. You made me question everything I believed about what makes a person worthy of love and respect. Trevor was staring at his phone again, probably reading more articles about Anderson events, his face getting paler with each new piece of information he discovered. The man who'd been so confident about calling me a fraud was slowly realizing that he'd spent the evening insulting someone who was more successful than he'd ever dreamed of being. But now I know, I said, looking around the table at their shocked faces. Now I know exactly who each of you are when you think there's nothing to gain from treating someone with basic human dignity. And that knowledge, that's something I'll carry with me for the rest of my life. Sometimes life has a twisted sense of poetic justice. One minute you're getting roasted alive by your in-laws, and the next minute you're watching those same people trip over themselves trying to figure out how to apologize for 3 years of treating you like garbage. It's like watching karma work in real time, except instead of feeling vindicated, all I felt was tired. The night ended differently than it began, that's for damn sure. Where we'd started with condescending smirks and public humiliation, we were now sitting in the kind of awkward silence that happens when everyone realizes they've been operating with completely wrong information for way too long. I looked over at Thomas, who was still standing there looking like he'd accidentally wandered into someone else's family drama. "Thomas," I said, my voice carrying the authority that came with being someone who actually could afford to make demands at establishments like this. "Let's book Robert and Evelyn's anniversary party. Full service, 100 guests, the works." The words came out easily, like I was ordering coffee instead of planning an event that would probably cost more than most people's annual salary. Thomas's face lit up like Christmas morning, not just because of the money, though I'm sure that was part of it, but because this was the kind of high-profile event that restaurants like Lou Bernardine lived for. "Of course, Mr. Anderson," he said, already pulling out his phone to make notes. "When were you thinking?" "Their anniversary is in 6 weeks, I said, glancing at Robert and Evelyn, who were both staring at me like I'd just offered to buy them a small country. "Let's make it memorable." Robert's face was cycling through emotions faster than a mood ring in a hot tub. Pride, gratitude, guilt, and something that might have been awe were all competing for space on his features. This was a man who'd worked his entire life to build something meaningful, and here was his son-in-law casually throwing around the kind of money that represented serious financial success. "Drake," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "you don't have to." "Yeah, I do," I interrupted gently. "This is what family does for each other. At least, this is what I want our family to be like going forward." The family raised their glasses then, not to mock me this time, but to toast me. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. An hour ago, these same people had been laughing at my supposed financial inadequacy, and now they were honoring the very success they'd been denying existed. "To Drake," Robert said, his voice carrying a pride that hadn't been there earlier in the evening. The words had weight to them, the kind of recognition that I'd been hoping for since the day I'd married his daughter. But I held up my hand, stopping him mid-toast. "To family," I corrected, because despite everything that had happened tonight, despite 3 years of feeling like an outsider, I still wanted to believe that we could build something real together, to understanding each other better. We drank to that, and for the first time all evening, the champagne actually tasted like celebration instead of expensive guilt. The aftermath was something to behold. We all walked outside into the cool Manhattan air, the city lights twinkling around us like some kind of expensive backdrop for this weird family reconciliation scene. The contrast between the warmth of the restaurant and the crisp night air felt symbolic somehow, like we were stepping into a different version of our relationships. Bianca was the first to approach me, looking like someone who'd been forced to eat a sandwich made entirely of crow. "Drake," she said, her voice smaller than I'd ever heard it, "I owe you a massive apology. What I said tonight, how I treated you. It was inexcusable." The apology felt genuine, which was something I hadn't expected from Bianca. This was a woman who usually doubled down on her mistakes rather than admitting she'd made them. Seeing her actually acknowledge that she'd been wrong was like watching a unicorn apologize for being mythical. Trevor followed suit, extending his hand for a handshake that felt more like a peace treaty than a greeting. "I was completely out of line," he said, his earlier arrogance replaced by what looked like genuine embarrassment. "I had no right to question you like that." Marcus was practically bouncing with excitement, his earlier condescension replaced by what looked like genuine admiration. Dude, can I pick your brain sometime about entrepreneurship? I mean, what you've built is incredible. Even Evelyn managed a stiff but sincere apology, though she looked like the words were physically painful to say. For a woman who'd spent 3 years treating me like an unfortunate mistake her daughter had made, admitting she'd been wrong was probably harder than childbirth. But it was Clara who mattered most. My wife walked beside me in silence as we made our way down the Manhattan sidewalk, her arm brushing against mine in that unconscious way that couples develop over time. There was a faint smile tugging at the corners of her lips, the first genuine smile I'd seen from her all evening. "So," she said finally, her voice carrying a mixture of amusement and something that might have been pride, "my husband is actually a multi-millionaire business mogul who's been pretending to be broke for 3 years. Guilty as charged," I said, unable to keep the smile out of my voice. For once, they weren't laughing at me. For the first time in 3 years, my wife's family was finally seeing me for who I actually was, not who they'd assumed I was. It felt like taking off shoes that had been too tight for way too long. Painful at first, but ultimately a relief. The night air was crisp and clean, and Manhattan stretched out around us like a promise of new beginnings.